Playboy, the ultimate symbol of American excess. And in the heart of the Vietnam War, it became a soldier's escape, not only for its attractive playmates, but also for its hard-hitting journalism, giving troops a moment's rest from the stresses of war. Playboy's bunny logo would be plastered everywhere throughout the war, a testament to the impact the magazine had on everyday life in Vietnam. And in the dying days of the Vietnam War, the magazine that had for so long boosted morale for the boots on the ground would find themselves out of the pages and hands-on in an active wartime mission. If Stars and Stripes was the newspaper of choice for US troops in World War II, then Playboy was Vietnam's magazine for the troops, being the most read magazine throughout the Vietnam War. Most would think the reason for Playboy's success would be through its centerfolds. Although this was massively appealing, it would be one of the few reasons why the magazine would gain its massive cult-like following. The magazine offered more than just escapism. It provided a window into a world rapidly changing back home in the States, also tackling issues within its pages that were taboo at the time, exploring everything from civil rights to homosexuality, making it more than just a simple magazine. It became a cultural phenomenon. US troops based in South Vietnam would often write to the magazine itself through the Playboy forum column, asking for advice and discussing personal troubles and events in society and in the country. Behind the velvet ropes, Playboy's owner Heugh Hefner had a surprising stance on the war. He would not openly support the politics surrounding the Vietnam War and the United States' involvement, but he was most certainly pro-soldier, regardless of the war they found themselves fighting, as he was himself a veteran. And in the final few days of this 35-year-long conflict, Playboy would impact the lives of those left in South Vietnam, this time in the orphanages and for the orphans left in Saigon.
In South Vietnam today, the communists are reported to be in firm control of at least 7 provinces and are fighting for at least 7 others. There was fighting today only 35 miles from Saigon, where officials have ordered the city's militia into a state of alarm and readiness.
In late March of 1975, it seemed as if South Vietnam's collapse was imminent, following the fall of major cities like Da Nang, with the country's population on the run from the advancing communists from the north. With South Vietnam's refugees herding into the streets of Saigon, one of the last remaining pockets of hope. Amidst this chaos, a silent tragedy would unfold, as thousands of innocent children orphaned by war would be cast adrift into a sea of fear. With the influx of refugees, Saigon's already full orphanages would be now filled to the absolute brim, as the city became one drowning in desperation, as medical supplies and food began to run dry. As the North continued its rapid advance southwards, more of the refugees would begin to fear what could potentially happen if the communists successfully took over. Rumors would begin to circulate of an impending bloodbath. As this theory quickly spread like wildfire, the South Vietnamese were still haunted by the horrors of the Tet Offensive, and they would fear the worst. Another merciless slaughter at the hands of the communist conquerors. The South Vietnamese most fearful of this impending bloodbath theory would be those who had collaborated with the Americans. And also, amongst the estimated 900,000 orphans, there was a distinct group known as the Amerasians, half Vietnamese, half American children of war, of which there was an estimated 10 to 15,000 living in South Vietnam. These Amerasian children were often the result of unprotected sex work, as they were abandoned by their American fathers and given up by their Vietnamese mothers to orphanages, as they could no longer continue their line of work as a sex worker with a child. The Amerasians represented a living symbol of American involvement in Vietnam, and as such their fate under a communist-controlled country was a terrifying unknown, as the situation in South Vietnam rapidly deteriorated. The remaining cities like Saigon and its orphanages were on the brink of collapse, as international aid organizations began to take desperate measures to try and get the Amerasians and the Vietnamese orphans out of the country. Private planes were pressed into service to help evacuate the orphans to their adoptive families waiting in the West, or to safety in nearby countries. The plight of the Amerasians had successfully pulled on the heartstrings of the American public. As such, a movement to save the orphans from what was thought to be impending doom quickly gained support. For some Americans, saving the orphans was seen as a way for the United States to atone its sins in Southeast Asia. The United States government had previously distanced itself from any responsibility and care for the Amerasian children left in Vietnam. Their stance on the topic was that the care of the Amerasians was never considered an area of government responsibility. Once more, due to increasing public outcry, the United States government would decide to change their plans. President Gerald R. Ford would announce Operation Babylift on April 3, 1975, after Congress approval, authorizing $2 million towards the operation. This daring humanitarian mission would involve private and military aircraft in a daily 30-flight schedule that would attempt to bring the orphans to safety.
Good evening. In South Vietnam today, a ghastly chapter was added to the pathos of war that has gripped that country for the past 30 years. A huge C-5 Air Force cargo plane carrying 243 South Vietnamese orphans to the United States, the first in the government-ordered airlift, crashed in a rice paddy near Saigon just minutes after takeoff. More than half the children and as many as 40 of the 62 escorts and crew aboard were killed.
The operation, which was intended to bring a sense of hope to those watching around the world, would begin in absolute tragedy on the exact first flight scheduled to leave Saigon, as it was dealt a cruel and devastating blow. A C-5A Galaxy transport plane would be brimming with over 250 orphans, nurses, as well as volunteers. A short 12 minutes after takeoff from Tong Son Nut Air Base en route to San Francisco, the locks on the rear cargo door of the C-5 would explode off, severely damaging the hydraulics and the flight controls in the tail of the aircraft. The pilots, unable to control the aircraft, would attempt to re-land at Tong Son Nut Air Base, but the plane was uncontrollable, crashing into a rice paddy 3 miles short of the runway. The impact of the crash would crush the cargo deck of the C-5, where almost all of the orphans were kept, crushing and trapping any survivors remaining. Of the some 250 original personnel on board the aircraft, 138 would be killed in the crash, including 78 orphans. The Galaxy crash would send shockwaves around the world, casting a dark shadow over the operation from the onset. Soon it became apparent that the 30 flights originally scheduled to evacuate the orphans were woefully inadequate. As the scope of the crisis became apparent for those on the ground, the initial plan expanded once more. More larger aircraft, such as Boeing 737s from private airliners, were brought in to help speed up the process of evacuation. The majority of the orphans would be evacuated to the United States, alongside the United Kingdom, Australia, and also the Philippines. The stars of Hollywood would also embrace the plight of the Vietnamese and Amerasian orphans. Among these compassionate stars was none other than Yul Brynner.
It is totally unacceptable to me when people dump on New York. But how can I stop them when it's plain to see we're dumping on ourselves? We've got to sweep our sidewalks, put our trash in plastic bags, the bags in cans, etc., etc. How can we get the world to respect us if we don't respect ourselves? If you're a New Yorker, then sweep it, can it, bag it, and don't dump on New York.
An actor most famous for his 1956 Academy Award-winning performance in The King and I, propelling him to absolute stardom. Yul Brynner was not only a famous actor, but he had also proven to be a loving father and family man to none other than a Vietnamese girl by the name of Mia, who he and his wife Jacqueline would adopt just a year prior in 1974. At the time, Yul Brynner and his wife Jacqueline were still keen on expanding their family once more. When the heartbreaking scenes of the Amerasian and Vietnamese orphans had reached them, their hearts would ache, and without hesitation they would decide to adopt another Vietnamese orphan in need, with the couple settling on adopting another Vietnamese girl named Melody, as she was one of the lucky few that had somehow miraculously survived the C-5 Galaxy crash. The aircraft which transported Melody to the States would touch down at the Presidio military base in San Francisco, alongside hundreds of other Vietnamese orphans and Amerasians, before flying their last leg of their journey to their adoptive families waiting on the East Coast. The orphans would undergo medical screenings. Once again, a familiar problem would rear its head, as once more a critical shortage of aircraft was available to transport the tiring orphans, even on US home soil. As the couple of Yul and Jacqueline waited anxiously back in New York City to meet their new adoptive daughter Melody, the lack of available aircraft to transport her became an issue in which the couple could no longer accept, deciding to take matters into their own hands. Using his Hollywood connections, Yul Brynner decided to make a phone call to none other than Heugh Hefner, asking his friend if he could lend the personal Playboy plane, known as the Big Bunny, to help airlift 41 orphans, including Melody, from San Francisco to New York's LaGuardia Airport. This extraordinary aircraft was essentially a flying Playboy mansion, a state-of-the-art DC-9 purchased for a staggering $5.5 million in 1969. The aircraft was custom designed for Heugh Hefner's jet-setting lifestyle between Chicago and Los Angeles. Heugh Hefner generously agreed to the request of Yul Brynner, and not only did the Big Bunny spring into action, but Heugh Hefner had also generously agreed to staff the Big Bunny with a select caring group of playmates to comfort the orphans across their journey in the skies of the United States. The orphans now on board the Big Bunny were described as being so small, it was as if they had just been pulled straight out of the delivery room. The orphans would be lying down throughout most of the journey on the floor of the aircraft's cabin, as some would even get the chance to rest and sleep on the waterbed of Heugh Hefner. As the orphans settled into the 6-hour-long flight, into the Big Bunny, which had now been transformed into a luxurious flying nursery. Beloved bunny mother Frankie Helms would play a pivotal role on that fateful day, as she would later describe the events on board the Big Bunny. I got a call at home close to midnight, asking me to be at the airport to help out. There were only 11 of us on board, each with 4 babies to tend. I would just finish changing one, and it would be time to do the next. Several of the infants were ill from the rich baby formula they weren't used to, and a few were badly scarred from burns they'd suffered from the plane crash. One of my little chargers could only be comforted if I held him and let him put his hand in my mouth. He was so frightened. By the time we reached New York and the waiting arms, I could barely let him go. As the Big Bunny arrived early in the morning at LaGuardia Airport on April 11, 1975, carrying aboard safely all of the 41 orphans, it would mark a new chapter for all of their lives. But the memories for those challenging hours would forever be imprinted on those all involved. After a long wait, Yul Brynner finally got the chance to meet his Vietnamese daughter Melody, after she endured a week of unimaginable challenges, as the young girl was now finally in the United States, after surviving tremendous odds, a plane crash, a change of country, and new parents in all less than a week. The dark underbelly which lurked beneath the facade of Operation Babylift began to reveal itself as more orphans began to arrive and questions began to arise. As the North Vietnamese closed in, more desperate measures were taken on the ground by the evacuation staff to get the orphans out of the country as soon as possible. In the chaos of the operation, it was discovered that a high number of orphans were indeed children with families, with most of them coming from the Vietnamese middle class. As the volunteer Vietnamese interpreters had discovered, that many of the children did not know where they were or what was happening to them. Other orphans were found to be wearing identification bracelets that often had made-up names on them, as the result of inadequate record keeping and frantic last-minute form filling. Some of the orphans' names were fabricated, making no sense whatsoever. But by that stage, much of the staff members were simply too tired to care. Of the approximately 2,500 to 3,000 orphans airlifted out of South Vietnam, between 250 and 1,500 were estimated to have never officially have been abandoned, with only 20% of the 2,000 to 3,000 orphans evacuated actually being Amerasians, despite these children being the main focal point behind the reasoning for the operation in the first place. As a result of Operation Babylift's shortcomings, 12,000 to 13,000 Amerasians were still left behind in Vietnam after the war. After the fall of South Vietnam and Saigon on April 30th, 1975, there would be no bloodbath theory as expected for those remaining or left behind, as the victorious North Vietnamese would not undertake the same violent route based off of theories from previous communist regime takeovers elsewhere around the world. The Amerasians and Vietnamese collaborators would not be slaughtered en masse as previously thought. For the captured collaborators in particular would be sent to communist re-education camps, with many collaborators spending upwards of 10 plus years in these camps, where the conditions were indeed not favorable. After the war, the adoptive agencies behind the whole operation would continue to reiterate their valid concerns in which they had, amidst the controversy in which became synonymous with this entire operation post-war. Orphanages nationwide in the reunified Vietnam would still continue to struggle to maintain their facilities, with Vietnam also being put under heavy international embargoes following the end of the conflict. By late September 1975, approximately 12 Vietnamese children had been voluntarily returned to their immediate or extended family members, avoiding legal proceedings. Others soon became embroiled in lawsuits trying to get their children back, as they looked upon the orphanages and adoptive agencies as only temporary sponsors willing to take their children to safety. A barrage of class action lawsuits were soon filed against the various adoptive agencies, which brought the orphans to the United States who were not properly released for immigration. The lawsuit was met with strong opposition from the adoptive parents, determined to keep the children for themselves. However, for those children who had not been adopted through the proper channels, and for whom the orphanages had no documentation, returning to Vietnam for these orphans was more of a possibility. For the Amerasians remaining in Vietnam, again now largely forgotten about, would continue to experience high levels of discrimination in Vietnamese society, even late into the 1980s, when American journalists began to return to Vietnam and the Amerasian stories began to be heard once more. The Amerasians' lives would drastically change with a single snap of a photograph and an article titled The Life and Times of Le Van Minh, who was an Amerasian boy stricken with polio. This powerful image capturing Minh's struggle to sell flowers on the streets of Ho Chi Minh City would spark widespread anger and outrage back in the US. As a result, a few short months later, a petition to bring Minh to the US for medical treatment quickly gained ever more momentum and traction, as Le Van Minh's story would help to shed light for the final time on the plight of the Amerasians.
The last time I talked to you from here, it was about the plight of Amerasian children. Amerasian children, half American, half Asian. Children of American servicemen abandoned in Asia. There was legislation pending in the lame duck session of Congress to make it easier for them to come in the United States. But
the unwavering support seen for Lee Van Min catalyzed a movement that would forever change the lives of those Amerasians left behind. In 1987, the Amerasian Homecoming Act, a landmark piece of legislation, was passed. This would grant immigration status to Amerasians born of American fathers. This historic act not only allowed these long-forgotten individuals to reunite with their ancestral homeland, but it also would extend a lifeline to their immediate relatives, allowing them to immigrate to the States as well. The Amerasian Homecoming Act ushered in a new era, providing a path to freedom for thousands of those left behind, greatly increasing Vietnamese immigration to the United States in the 1980s. For the majority of the orphans that settled and stayed in their new adoptive nations would go on to live prosperous lives more often than not, with many eventually returning back home to Vietnam at some point or other to connect with their roots and often find long-lost family members which they had not seen in decades. With the iconic Playboy mansion purchased in 1971, it would signal a new era for Heugh Hefner, with the need of frequent travel between Los Angeles and Chicago now eliminated. The once indispensable Big Bunny now quickly became a relic of the past. A year after the airlift in 1976, the Big Bunny was sold, but its journey far from over, as the plane would now transform and fly as part of Venezuelan Airlines up until 1979, before being sold once more to Aeromexico, where the plane would fly up until as late as 2004. Today, the iconic Big Bunny, an aircraft once owned by Heugh Hefner and which took part in Operation Babylift, silently resides in a museum in Mexico City, where the aircraft nowadays is mostly used for school tours.
Back in the States, actor Yul Brynner died early this morning of cancer at the age of 65. Brian Doble reports.
The iconic actor Yul Brynner would tragically pass away at the age of 65 from lung cancer in 1985. Yet his legacy would live on through his adoptive daughters, Melody and Mia, who are still alive today in the United States, as they chose to live their lives in private, out of the public eye. The iconic Playboy founder Heugh Hefner would pass away in 2017 at the age of 91 from E. coli. His legacy, however, extends far beyond the world of entertainment. A controversial man, as some would see him as either a saint or a sinner, he no doubt lived an extraordinary life, and his involvement in Operation Babylift was just one of the many fascinating tales in the life and legacy of Heugh Hefner. However, Operation Babylift would not be the final instance in which a Hefner has helped out orphans and refugees in need, for Heugh Hefner's youngest son, Cooper Hefner, would go on to follow his father's history of service, deciding to halt his successful businesses in 2019 to enlist in the Air Force Reserves.
President Biden is sticking with an August 31st deadline, 1 week from today, to withdraw some 6,000 troops from Afghanistan.
Amidst the collapse of Afghanistan in 2021, the US government would announce Operation Allies Welcome, granting humanitarian parole and evacuation status to Afghans in need of rapid relocation back stateside. The Afghans in need would arrive to the States at one of 4 designated military processing bases, one of which being Fort Dix in New Jersey. This is where Cooper Hefner was soon to be deployed, tasked with the aiding of the processing of the Afghan refugees, as well as providing any additional medical assistance. A few weeks later, Cooper Hefner would get a chance to reflect on his involvement in Operation Allies Welcome, stating the following: "Weeks ago, I joined a task force of State Department staff, ambassadors, and members of the private sector to charter aircraft, provide security and raise for Afghan resettlement. We've evacuated over 475 women leaders and their families. We've raised over $7 million. We will keep at it.